The lock had not moved in 300 years. Cassandra Blackwell's fingers trembled against the ancient iron as the mechanism surrendered to her, tumbling open with a sound like the last breath of something long buried. Behind her, the entire vampire court had gone silent. Not the polite silence of decorum, the dangerous silence of predators who had just watched something impossible happen. She did not turn around, not yet, because the chamber before her was exhaling, actually exhaling, a current of cold air that carried the scent of old parchment and something older still, something that made the hair on the back of her neck rise with the instinctive recognition of enormous sleeping power. Step away from that door. The voice came from across the marble hall, low and absolute, the kind of voice that had commanded armies and ended bloodlines. Lucretius Vale, High Steward of the Von Carstein court, had crossed the distance between them in under a second, and now stood 2 feet behind her with his ivory hand raised as though he intended to physically remove her. Cassandra turned then. She turned slowly, deliberately, because she had learned in 6 months serving the court that showing fear was not an option she could afford. She was the only human archivist in the history of the Von Carstein estate. Every vampire in this hall had voted against her appointment. Every one of them had spent 6 months waiting for her to fail. She was not going to give them the satisfaction. "The High Steward will note," she said calmly, her voice carrying through the vaulted chamber with the precision she had cultivated through years of academic discipline, "that I was assigned the restoration of the Eastern Archive. The Eastern Archive includes this corridor." The lock responded to the resonance key I reconstructed from the 1743 cipher manuscripts. "That falls within my documented mandate." Lucretius's pale eyes narrowed to silver slivers. He was beautiful in the way that blades were beautiful, elegantly lethal, without warmth. His white hair fell across one shoulder in a calculated cascade, and the contempt in his expression was centuries old. "You are a human. You have no mandate within the sealed chambers. No human has ever opened that door. The fact that you have done so is not a testament to your qualification. It is a warning." The court murmured. Cassandra heard it, the mixture of unease, curiosity, and the particular hostility that had followed her everywhere since she had first walked through these doors with her rolling cart of archival equipment and her carefully organized binders. She had been dismissed at every turn. By Lucretius, who called her an experiment in the Lord's eccentricity, by Lady Mira Nocten, who had laughed openly during the appointment ceremony, by the junior court members who moved her reference materials when she wasn't looking and locked sections of the archive without telling her. She had been dismissed, overlooked, talked over, talked past, and quietly sabotaged for 6 months. And yet here, she stood at the threshold of the chamber that no one in 3 centuries had managed to open. She was about to say something measured and controlled when the doors at the far end of the hall opened, and the entire court went still in a different way entirely. The first kind of stillness had been danger. This was reverence, laced with fear. Zarek Von Carstein walked in, and the room rearranged itself around him the way gravity rearranged everything. Not by force, but by the simple, undeniable fact of his presence. He was tall, white-haired like all his court, but where theirs was fine and aristocratic, his fell heavy and silver like starlight given weight past his shoulders and unbound. His skin was the particular white of marble that had never seen sun, and his eyes were the color of deep amber, lit from within by something that was not quite fire. He wore a modern suit in charcoal and black, because he had always understood that dominance needed no costume. But the way he wore it transformed the garment into something that belonged to no era and every era simultaneously. He was perhaps the most genuinely dangerous thing Cassandra had ever been in a room with, and she had spent 3 years researching in conflict zones before this appointment. He took in the scene in under a second. Cassandra at the chamber door, the open lock in her hand, Lucretius with his arm raised in threat, and something moved across his features that the court clearly did not expect, because the murmuring stopped entirely. "Lucretius, 1 word." The arm came down immediately. Zarek crossed the hall. The court parted for him without theatre, stepping aside the way deep water parts, for something moving through it with absolute certainty. He stopped before Cassandra, and the distance between them was closer than propriety suggested it should be. close enough that she could feel the particular cold that radiated from him, the supernatural temperature of something that had traded warmth for eternity. He looked at the open lock. He looked at the dark chamber beyond. Then he looked at her, and the amber of his eyes held something that she could not immediately name. "How?" he said, not an accusation. An honest question. Cassandra held his gaze, because looking away would be a kind of defeat, and she had not come this far to be defeated. The 1743 Valen cipher. It was stored in the sub-archive under 3 different cataloging errors, I believe deliberately. The cipher encodes a resonance frequency rather than a mechanical combination. Most people assumed it was a musical notation with archival notation overlaid. I rebuilt the frequency pattern from the original notation and encoded it into the key blank from your grandfather's personal effects. She paused, which was also misfiled incidentally, under candle inventory. Something happened then that no one in the court had seen in a very long time. The corner of Zarek Von Carstein's mouth moved, not a smile, not precisely, but something adjacent to one, something that passed across his face like the shadow of something warmer than a vampire lord was supposed to be. "Come inside," he said, and then, over her head to the court, "All others remain." The murmuring that followed as he closed the chamber door behind them was, Cassandra thought, probably the most satisfying sound she had heard in 6 months. The chamber was extraordinary. It was not a room. It was a library, a private, hidden archive unlike anything she had encountered in her career, and she had worked in the restricted collections of 3 national archives, 2 private estates, and 1 classified government vault. The shelves ran floor to ceiling, which was easily 30 feet, and every shelf was filled, not with dusty, neglected volumes, but with materials that were organized, maintained, and clearly still in active use. Glass cases held documents under controlled humidity. Scroll racks lined an entire interior wall, and at the center of the room, beneath the cold glow of recessed lighting that someone had installed at some point in the last 50 years, without disturbing a single original architectural feature, stood a reading desk with an open journal on it. The journal was not old. The ink on the open page was fresh. Cassandra stopped walking. She looked at the journal. She looked at Zarek, who had gone completely still in the way that only very old, very controlled things went still when they were trying not to reveal something. "You work in here," she said. "Yes." "Alone?" "Always." She looked around the room again with new eyes, recalibrating. This was not a sealed chamber that had been forgotten. This was a sealed chamber that had been intentionally hidden. The contents were not remnants of a past that no longer mattered. They were ongoing. This was where Zarek Von Carstein came when he needed to be somewhere that the court could not follow. "The Valen cipher," she said slowly. "Your grandfather commissioned it in 1743. To seal this room from everyone," he confirmed. The formality in his voice had shifted slightly, the layer of court performance dropping away in a manner so subtle that she might have missed it if she had been less trained to notice the difference between performed and genuine. The cipher was designed to require a specific kind of understanding to reconstruct, not power, not lineage, analytical comprehension of both archival science and harmonic resonance theory. "You designed the lock for someone like me," Cassandra said. The realization arrived fully formed and hit her with the weight of 6 months of dismissed work, ignored expertise, casual cruelty from a court that had never wanted her here. "You designed it for a human archivist." "I'd designed it," Zarek said, "for the right human archivist. I had not anticipated waiting this long." The silence that followed was the kind that changes rooms. Cassandra sat down in the reading chair across from the desk, because she needed a moment to reconstruct her entire understanding of why she was here. Zarek watched her do it without interfering, which she was beginning to understand was a significant thing for him. Standing back, letting her think, not filling silence with dominance. "The court doesn't know you commissioned my appointment," she said. "Lucretius believes it was a political eccentricity. The others believe it was an experiment or a provocation. They were not corrected." "Why?" He moved to the desk, to the journal, and closed it with deliberate care. "Because the contents of this chamber, and the reason a human archivist was needed, are not something the court is positioned to receive without consequences that I am not ready to manage." Cassandra studied him. He was standing with his back slightly to her, And there was something in the line of his shoulders that she recognized. Not uncertainty, not weakness, but the particular tension of someone who had been carrying something alone for a very long time. "What is in this chamber, Zarek?" His name came out before she could add the title, the formal address. She braced for the reaction. He turned. The amber eyes settled on her with an intensity that she felt in her chest. "Everything," he said. "Everything the Von Carstein line has done, and everything it has failed to do, and one very specific thing that must be undone before it destroys us all." That was the beginning. She came back every night for the following 2 weeks. And every night the work changed her understanding. The hidden archive was a record of the Von Carstein bloodline's political history, stretching back 11 centuries. But it was also something else. A record of the blood laws that the court publicly endorsed, and the private documentation of Zarek's growing opposition to them. The blood laws were old-world codes that governed the relationship between vampires and the humans who existed in their orbit, ranging from contract provisions about human employees of vampire estates to deeply troubling provisions about what the older courts called feeding rights, provisions that had been enforced in the 19th century with brutality and that Zarek had been quietly, systematically dismantling through legal and political channels for decades. But there was one blood law he had not yet been able to challenge. This oldest one. The one written in the founding charter of the Vampire High Court, which sat above all individual courts, including his own. The Covenant of Primacy stated that any human who gained unsanctioned access to vampire proprietary knowledge, which the High Court interpreted broadly and aggressively, could be claimed as a ward of the discovering court. It was a law that had been used historically to trap humans in indentured arrangements. And it was a law that Lucretius had already invoked twice in Zarek's tenure against humans employed at rival courts. Cassandra read the relevant documents on the 4th night and sat with the implications for a long, quiet moment before she spoke. "If Lucretius files a primacy claim against me for opening this chamber," she said, "he cannot." Zarek said immediately, from where he stood at the scroll racks across the room, "I hold the sanctioning authority for this estate. The claim would require my acknowledgement of unsanctioned access, which I will not provide, because your access was always sanctioned. By me, before you arrived, but he doesn't know that, no, and if he finds proof that you designed the cipher for a human archivist, he will bring it to the High Court as evidence of pre-planned human elevation, which the High Court could interpret as a challenge to the Covenant of Primacy itself." She set the document down. "You've been preparing to challenge the Covenant. This archive is your evidence base." The silence confirmed it before he spoke. "The Covenant of Primacy is 311 years old," Zarek said, moving from the scroll racks to the desk with his hands clasped behind his back. His movement the slow, deliberate pace of someone choosing words with the same care they would choose weapons. "It has been used to justify harm against humans in proximity to vampire courts in ways that have no defensible foundation in ethics, logic, or the practical reality of how our world functions in modernity. The High Court has resisted every formal challenge because every challenger has lacked comprehensive documentation of the law's application history." He paused. "I have been compiling that documentation for 40 years. Cassandra looked at the shelves around her with new understanding. 40 years of solitary work. Hidden from a court that would have used it against him. Hidden from a High Court that would have moved to neutralize the threat. He had built this, alone in silence, while presenting the face of a traditional vampire lord to everyone watching. You needed someone who could cross-reference the application issues against the founding charters and identify the legal inconsistencies, she said. You needed an archivist. I needed the best archivist. The correction was quiet and completely genuine. The application history spans 11 jurisdictions and 4 languages, and the founding charters contained deliberate ambiguities that were inserted to allow selective interpretation. Identifying the inconsistencies requires someone who can hold the entire document history simultaneously and navigate the places where the language was designed to obscure rather than clarify. That is, Cassandra said slowly, an extremely specific description of my doctoral thesis. Yes, she stared at him. You read my doctoral thesis. I read your doctoral thesis, your 3 subsequent publications, your case documentation from the Copenhagen archive dispute, and a paper you wrote for a restricted government consultation that you are probably surprised I have access to." Cassandra felt something shift inside her chest. Not discomfort, though it perhaps should have been. Something warmer and more complicated. She had spent 6 months being dismissed by everyone in this building, treated as an afterthought, a novelty, an insignificance. And the one person who ran the entire court had read every word she had ever published and built a lock that only she could open. "I find it somewhat irritating," she said carefully, "that you chose to express confidence in my abilities by hiding it inside an elaborate cipher puzzle rather than simply telling me why I was here." Something genuinely surprised moved across his face. Then that not-quite smile returned. Warmer this time, something that reached the amber of his eyes. "I could not tell you why you were here without exposing the Chamber's purpose, and I could not expose the Chamber's purpose until I knew whether you would use the knowledge to protect the work or leverage it for personal advancement. You were testing me, not an accusation, an observation. I was learning you," he said. The distinction, the deliberateness of the word choice, landed somewhere it was not supposed to land and stayed there. There is a difference. The work accelerated after that, because Cassandra now understood what she was building toward. She spent the days in the main archive, maintaining the performance of her official role with meticulous care, because the court's contempt was a kind of cover. If they continued to believe she was merely cataloguing dusty correspondence, they would not watch her closely enough to notice what she was actually doing. The nights in the hidden chamber became their architecture together. She organized, cross-referenced, and constructed the legal argument with the methodical precision that was her nature, while Zarek provided context, translated the older documents, and occasionally stopped her by saying things like, "That section is deliberately incomplete." The original was destroyed in 1887 by the then-sitting High Steward. "I have a secondary source." He always had a secondary source. He had been waiting 40 years to deploy them all. What she had not anticipated was the way the hours would feel. She had expected the work to be the center of the chamber. She had not expected conversation to become its own kind of architecture, building something between them, room by room, corridor by corridor. The way long work sessions with someone you respect and find genuinely interesting inevitably build things you cannot entirely name. She learned that he had turned 622 years ago in what was now Hungary, during a period he described with the unsentimental precision of someone who had made peace with their history while retaining the accuracy of it. She learned that he had inherited the court at 230, which by vampire reckoning made him young for the responsibility, and that the early decades of his leadership had been a political siege he had survived, by being more strategically intelligent than everyone who assumed emotion was a weakness. She learned that he read constantly, not the court histories that other lords collected as trophies, but contemporary literature, philosophy, scientific journals, mathematics, architecture. He had thoughts about all of them, and they were interesting thoughts. And the habit of dismissing her that the rest of the court had built so carefully was impossible to maintain in a room where the most powerful vampire in the building treated her opinions as the ones most worth hearing. She told him things too. Things she had not said to many people. About the years of work that had earned her the qualifications that the court's members sneered at because they had no framework for valuing human academic achievement. About the specific exhausting loneliness of being extremely good at something that most people could not see clearly enough to recognize. About her family, her mother, who had died when Cassandra was 19 and left her a box of letters, and a very clear understanding that intelligence without courage was merely decoration. He listened to all of it. He listened the way that very old things listened, completely, without performing interest, with the particular quality of attention that made her feel that the things she said were being stored somewhere permanent. The crisis arrived on a Tuesday 23 days after the chamber opened. Cassandra was in the main archive, alone, working on the 4th century correspondence files, when she found the document by accident. It was misfiled, like so much else in a collection that had been deliberately disorganized, tucked between 2 letters of no consequence. She pulled it out, unfolded it, and read it twice before she fully understood what she was holding. It was a filing notice from the High Court. Dated 8 days ago, addressed to Lucretius Vale, it was a formal notification that the High Court had received an application for a covenant of primacy review of the Von Carstein estate, filed by an anonymous court member citing evidence of pre-planned human elevation and requesting authority to conduct an unannounced audit of all estate archives. The audit date was set for 4 days from now. Cassandra was on her feet before she had made a conscious decision to move. She folded the document, placed it in her jacket pocket, and walked at a measured pace through the corridors of the estate until she reached the private study where Zarek held his evening administrative sessions. She did not knock. She opened the door, stepped inside, and closed it behind her. He was at his desk with 2 senior court members, Mira Nocten and a male vampire named Aldrich Tessavere, who both turned to look at her with expressions that ranged from contemptuous surprise to outright offense. "This is a closed session," Mira said. "I am aware," Cassandra said. She met Zarek's eyes across the room, and she held up the folded document. She watched him read her expression the same way she had learned to read his. "Leave us," he said to Mira and Aldrich. The protest was immediate. Aldrich stood from his chair. "My lord, this is a human servant who has just walked into a restricted." "Leave us," Zarek said again, in a tone that had not risen in volume at all, and yet contained something that made both vampires move toward the door without further argument. When the door closed, Cassandra crossed the room and handed him the document. She watched him read it. She watched the stillness that came over him, not the reactive stillness of surprise, but the deeper stillness of someone absorbing a threat and beginning to organize a response. She had seen it before, in the chamber, when she uncovered documentation that complicated the legal case. But this was larger than complication. "Someone in the court filed this," she said. "Yes, Lucretius. Almost certainly." He set the document on the desk with controlled care. The anonymous provision of the filing procedure is intended to allow court members to raise legitimate concerns without political retaliation. It is routinely exploited for exactly this kind of preemptive attack. Cassandra sat down across from him without being invited, because the situation had moved beyond the rituals of decorum. The hidden chamber. If the High Court auditors reach it, the work is unfinished. The legal argument cannot be filed without the complete cross-referencing documentation, which requires another 3 weeks minimum. His jaw tightened. It was a small movement, but visible. If the High Court seizes the archive under primacy review authority, they will suppress it, not just delay it, permanently bury it, and the covenant of primacy remains intact, along with every provision it enables. The amber eyes were very dark. 300 years of harm, documented in that chamber, and another 300 years of the same harm, enabled by the destruction of the one archive comprehensive enough to challenge it. Cassandra was quiet for a moment, thinking. This was what she did when the stakes were highest. She went quiet and she thought, and the thinking was not passive. She ran variables, tested solutions, discarded the inadequate ones, and kept the ones that held. Can you contest the audit authority on procedural grounds? The filing is anonymous, which should require the High Court to establish preliminary standing before authorizing invasive action. Under normal circumstances, yes, the preliminary standing review takes a minimum of 30 days. Something moved in his expression. But there is a provision under the covenant of primacy allowing the High Court to waive the standing review if the application includes a sworn statement from a court member with direct personal knowledge of the alleged violation. The implication arrived fully formed. Lucretius has personal knowledge. He was standing in the hall when I opened the chamber. Yes, which means he can swear the statement, the standing review is waived, and the audit proceeds in 4 days as scheduled. Yes. Cassandra sat with this for another moment. What would happen to you if the archive is seized and the High Court finds what's in it? The pause before he answered was small, but she caught it. Censure at minimum. Removal of court authority is possible. The High Court has mechanisms for dealing with lords who are considered to be actively working against High Court interests. Those mechanisms are not pleasant, and to me? He looked at her directly, and the amber held something that she was beginning to be able to read more accurately. Primacy claim, without question. If the High Court determines that your access to the chamber was pre-planned and that you have been working with the archive's contents, you would be considered a knowing participant in a challenge to High Court authority. The implications of that status are— He stopped. "Tell me." "Significant," he said, and the deliberateness with which he chose the soft word told her more than the harsh word would have. "I would not permit it to reach that outcome." "That is not the same as telling me it cannot reach that outcome." "No," he agreed, "it is not." She appreciated the honesty enough not to push harder on it. She turned her attention back to the problem. "All right, 4 days. 3 weeks of work remaining. The math is not workable as it currently stands, which means we need to change the current situation rather than work within it." She looked at him. "The most complete version of the legal argument. Not the perfect version, but the version that is legally sufficient to initiate a formal challenge. How much of the cross-referencing documentation does it require?" He understood immediately. The amber sharpened. "You are proposing to file an incomplete argument. I am proposing to file a sufficient argument before the audit occurs. If the challenge is already formally registered with the High Court before the auditors arrive, the seizure authority is suspended pending review of the challenge itself. Is that correct?" The pause this time was the pause of someone working through implications at speed. "Yes. Under the separation doctrine, an active legal challenge to a High Court provision cannot be suppressed by an action taken under the authority of that same provision. It creates a legal conflict that freezes both actions pending independent arbitration. So if we file in 3 days, the audit is suspended, the archive is protected while arbitration proceeds." He was very still. "The argument as it stands is strong. Incomplete, but strong. The arbitration panel would have access to the existing documentation, and if the panel is not entirely composed of High Court loyalists—" "Can you influence the panel composition?" "I have alliances. Some among the independent court lords who have no love for High Court overreach." He looked at her with something that held an edge of something she could only describe as fierce. "You would be working continuously for 3 days to complete the minimum threshold documentation, without sleep. I am well aware of what I would be doing. I am asking whether the plan is legally sound." "It is legally sound," he said, and then quietly, "Cassandra." Her name in his voice had a particular quality. She had noticed it before, the way he said it differently than everyone else did. Everyone else in this building said her name the way they handled all things human, with varying degrees of dismissal. He said it as though it was the name of something he was being careful with. "This risk is not yours to carry," he said. "You were brought here for the archival work. The political consequences of what I have built in that chamber are mine, not yours. I can relocate the archive's physical contents within the next 48 hours, reduce the exposure. Moving the archive is a destruction scenario," she said firmly. "You cannot move 3 centuries of carefully controlled humidity documents at speed without significant physical damage, and the organizational logic of the collection is load-bearing to the legal argument. You know this." She met his eyes and held them. "I am not asking your permission to do this work. I am telling you that I intend to do it. What I need from you is the High Court filing procedure and access to every document in the chamber." The silence was different from all the silences before it, warmer, more complicated. And then he said, very quietly, "You are remarkable." It was the first time in 6 months that anyone in this building had said anything like that to her, and the source of it, and the complete absence of performance in how he said it, made something close in her throat that she refused to let reach her face. "I am an archivist," she said. "This is what archivists do. We protect records." But they both understood that the record she was choosing to protect was larger than documents. They worked through the night, and the next night, and the night after that. The 3 days became a kind of sustained intensity that burned everything extraneous away. Cassandra moved through the hidden archive with the single-minded focus of someone who had narrowed their entire world to a task and given it everything. And Zarek worked beside her in a way she had not expected, not directing, not managing, but actually working, side by side, translating archival Latin at a speed she could not match. Cross-referencing the older documents with a memory that was its own kind of living archive, handing her things at exactly the moments she needed them, as though he had memorized her working rhythm and tuned himself to it. On the second night, somewhere around 3 in the morning, she fell asleep at the reading desk. She woke to find a blanket around her shoulders, a glass of water on the desk beside her, and Zarek seated across the room in the reading chair, with a document in his hands, his white hair loose around his face, and an expression that she caught for only a second before he composed it. The expression of someone watching something they have come to care about, with a care they have not yet decided what to do with. She did not comment on the blanket. She drank the water, rolled her neck, and went back to work. But something about the gesture, so small, so entirely without audience, settled into her like light into an old room. On the third day, with 6 hours until the audit team was scheduled to arrive, Cassandra completed the threshold documentation. She sat back. She read through the summary argument. She found 3 minor inconsistencies, corrected them, and read it again. Then she set it down on the desk and said, "It is done." Zarek read it in approximately 12 minutes, which was terrifying to witness, and when he set it down, the expression on his face was one she had no category for, something vast and still, like the moment before a storm breaks and becomes something else entirely. "This is sufficient," he said. "It is more than sufficient," Cassandra replied. The application history documentation in sections 4 through 7 provides a pattern of abuse that the arbitration panel cannot dismiss without willful blindness. And the founding charter ambiguities I identified in section 12 are going to be particularly difficult for the High Court's counsel to explain away. "The argument you constructed in section 12, he said slowly, identifies a deliberate insertion of conflicting language by the original High Court draftsman. If the arbitration panel accepts the linguistic analysis, the entire covenant of primacy becomes legally suspect, and the High Court will be forced to either defend an indefensible drafting history or accept a revision process." She paused. "It is a strong argument. It is a devastating argument," he said with a precision that was its own form of warmth. He filed the challenge with the High Court at 2 in the morning, 6 hours before the audit team arrived. Cassandra stood beside him in the hidden chamber as he transmitted the filing, and when the confirmation arrived, she felt the release of something that had been held tight for 3 days exhale from both of them simultaneously. The audit team arrived at 8 and was met at the estate doors by Zarek's legal counsel, a vampire named Thessaly Draven, who was apparently very good because she handled the suspended audit proceeding with an efficiency that Cassandra found deeply satisfying to hear about later. The danger had not ended. She understood that. Lucretius would escalate. The High Court would respond to the challenge with hostility and political pressure. The arbitration process would take months, possibly longer, and during those months, Zarek and the estate and everyone associated with the challenge would be under scrutiny and threat that had no comfortable resolution. But the immediate crisis had passed, and in the space after it, something that had been building through 23 nights of shared work in a room that belonged to both of them now had nowhere left to hide. She found him in the hidden chamber that evening, alone, the journal open on the desk but nothing written on the page. He was looking at the far wall with the distant quality of someone working through a calculation that was not mathematical. "You should sleep," he said without turning. "You have not slept properly in 3 days." "I will," she said. "I wanted to say something first." He turned then, and the amber eyes were very open, more open than she had ever seen them. Whatever professional careful distance he maintained with the court stripped entirely away in the privacy of this room. "Then say it. I know why you didn't tell me the real reason I was here when I arrived," she said. "I understand the logic. I understand the risk. I am not arguing with the decision." She moved further into the room, stopping at the reading desk. "But I want you to know that the 6 months of being dismissed, of being treated as a decoration or an experiment or an eccentricity by your court, who took their cue from the appearance of indifference that you had to maintain, that was hard. It was genuinely hard. And I need you to know that, not so that you feel guilty, but so that the full truth of what happened here is in the record." He held her gaze. He did not flinch from it, and he did not minimize it, and he did not perform regret for her benefit. "It was wrong," he said simply. "I built a situation that caused you harm in order to protect a work that I had no certainty you would choose to be part of. The protection of the archive does not balance against what you experienced during those months. I am aware of that. I know you are, she said. That is why I am telling you instead of simply being angry. The silence after that was very quiet, and she could feel it filled with all the things that the work and the danger and the 3 days of sustained collaboration had been building toward. The way pressure builds in a room when the temperature changes and all the air shifts without making a sound. I have been doing something for 40 years, Zarek said carefully, that I had no expectation of completing within my political lifetime. I had made a kind of peace with the solitude of it. I had not anticipated. He stopped. Say it, she said, echoing his own words back to him. The amber eyes held something so unguarded that it made her breath catch. I had not anticipated you. And there it was, 3 words so precise in their simplicity, carrying the weight of 6 months and 40 years and 6 centuries and everything that did not have a category yet. And Cassandra crossed the distance between them because she was not someone who waited when she understood what was true. She took his face in her hands, which were warm against the cold of his skin, and she kissed him in the room that both of them had built together. He was still for 1 second, that complete, focused stillness she had come to recognize, and then he kissed her back, and his hands came to her waist with a care that was also entirely unlike the way he held everything else in this world, because as everything else he held for strategic purpose, and this he was holding, because it was the thing he most wanted not to let go of. They stood in the middle of the hidden archive, in the light of the room that 300 years of isolation had been waiting to share, and everything that had been building since a lock had opened and a court had gone silent and a voice had said, "How?" With genuine curiosity, instead of performance, finally arrived. The weeks that followed were different, the court noticed. Of course the court noticed. Vampires who had survived centuries had very good instincts for the politics of connection, and the shift in the relationship between the lord of the estate and the human archivist was not something that could be entirely contained. The primary visible change was that Cassandra was no longer dismissible. Not because Zarek announced anything. He did not perform his feelings for the court's benefit, and she respected that he trusted her to hold her own ground without the theatre of public declaration. But because the thing that the court had been using as a framework for how to treat her, the appearance of lordly indifference, was now transparently gone, Lucretius was the first to test the new dynamic. He attempted to reassign her archive access during a court session, citing protocol grounds, in a move that was clearly designed to establish whether the status change between her and Zarek was something he could work around or exploit. He framed it as administrative concern, his voice carrying the particular coated contempt of someone who had never needed to be overtly hostile, because the structures around him had always done that work. Zarek's response was very quiet and very complete. He revoked Lucretius's administrative authority over the archive entirely, transferred it to Thessaly Draven, the same legal counsel who had handled the suspended audit, and did all of this in a single brief statement during the same court session without raising his voice or changing his expression. The court was very still afterward, recalibrating. Mira Nocten tried a different approach. She sought out Cassandra alone in the main archive 2 days later, moving with the elegant predatory grace of someone who had spent centuries learning to make ceilings feel low. She sat on the edge of the archive table and looked at Cassandra the way she looked at everything she considered beneath her attention, with a particular species of condescension that Cassandra had stopped finding intimidating approximately 3 months ago. "You understand," Mira said pleasantly, "that this cannot continue in any meaningful way. He is 6 centuries old. He is a vampire lord. You are a human with a 70-year life expectancy, on a generous estimate. Whatever this is, it is a diversion. They always are." Cassandra kept her eyes on the document she was cataloguing. "I appreciate the concern. I am not expressing concern. I am expressing a factual limitation of your biology." Mira tilted her head. "He will not turn you. The laws governing voluntary turning require High Court sanction and are currently complicated by the challenge your filing has created. And even if he could, a voluntary turning under current political conditions would be read as a statement of permanent alliance between the Von Carstein line and the human cause, which would escalate the arbitration conflict significantly. Cassandra set down the document. She turned and looked at Mira directly, giving her the kind of full, level attention that she had learned made most people uncomfortable because it contained no request for approval. "You are telling me this," she said, "because you believe the most effective way to destabilize the relationship is to make me feel temporary. To frame it as structurally impossible so that I step back from it myself and save you the trouble of attempting to engineer the separation." She picked the document back up. "Thank you for the information. All of it." Mira left without responding. Cassandra heard about the conversation from Thessaly, who had apparently heard about it from 3 different sources, and found it the most satisfying report she had received in decades. But Mira had said something that Cassandra could not entirely set aside, not because it had been intended to wound, but because it was true. She was human. Zarek was not. The gap between their lifespans was not an abstraction. It was a fact, and she had been raised to deal with facts. She brought it to Zarek in the hidden chamber, because there was only one place she could bring the things that actually mattered. "Mira came to see me," she said. "I know. He was at the scroll racks, which was where he went when he was thinking. I heard. She was not wrong about the structural limitation." "No," he agreed, turning. "She was not." Cassandra sat in the reading chair, the one she had come to think of as hers, and looked at him. "You haven't said anything about it, the time difference. We've talked about everything in this room. 3 centuries of vampire political history, 11 jurisdictions of legal documentation, your 6th century personal history, and you have not said one word about the fact that you are immortal and I am not." "I have not said anything about it," he said, moving toward the desk with the deliberate quiet that characterized everything he did when he was being honest. "Because I was afraid of what you would decide if I did." The admission landed with the full weight of what it cost a man like him to say it. She held it carefully. "Tell me what you were afraid I would decide." He sat down across from her, elbows on his knees, the amber eyes very direct. "That the gap is too large, that what we are is not practical, that you would choose to protect yourself from a grief that you cannot avoid by creating a smaller, more managed distance now." He paused. "I have been 6 centuries in this world, and I have watched many things end, and I have carried many ends. I am not afraid of ends. What I am afraid of is that you will decide that the end is inevitable, and remove yourself from the present on the basis of a future that has not yet arrived." Cassandra was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I watched my mother die when I was 19. She had been ill for 2 years, and I knew from the first diagnosis that she was going to die, and I had 2 options. I could spend those 2 years protecting myself from the grief by maintaining a careful distance, or I could spend them being present and losing her completely and carrying that loss for the rest of my life." She held his gaze. "I have never regretted the choice I made." Something crossed his face that was the most unguarded thing she had ever seen on it. He reached across the desk and covered her hand with his, and she felt the familiar cold and held it the way she had learned to hold it, as the specific, irreplaceable temperature of him. "The turning question is complicated," she said. "I understand that. I am not asking for it to be resolved immediately. The High Court's current position on voluntary turnings in political conflict periods is what Mira described accurately. Filing a challenge to the covenant of primacy creates a period of elevated scrutiny in which a turning would be legally and politically provocative." He was very careful with each word. "The arbitration timeline is estimated at 8 to 12 months. After the challenge resolves, and it will resolve, the argument you built is strong enough that even a hostile panel will be required to acknowledge the drafting inconsistencies. The political climate shifts significantly. 8 to 12 months, she said, is a long time for a human," he said quietly. "I know that. It is a normal amount of time for a human," she corrected gently. "We do not experience time the same way. 8 months is not negligible, but it is also not a lifetime." She turned her hand over under his, threading her fingers with his. "I am not going anywhere. I am telling you this so that the calculation you have clearly been running about whether to have this conversation stops running in the background of everything else." He looked down at her hands sent together, her warmth and his cold. And when he looked back up, the ambers was full of something she had no existing word for. Something that encompassed the weight of 6 centuries and the specific, particular gravity of now. "I want you to stay," he said. "Not a request, a truth offered without armor." "I know," she said. "I want to stay." The arbitration moved forward over the following months with the grinding, incremental tension of a major legal process designed by and for entities who measured time in decades. Cassandra worked through it with the same methodical focus she had brought to the archive, providing supplementary documentation as the arbitration panel requested it, constructing additional supporting briefs when the High Court's counsel attempted to introduce counter-arguments, and developing what Thessaly Draven described with undisguised admiration as the most comprehensive dismantling of a High Court provision since the Reform Accords of 1954. The High Court was not passive during this period. There were political moves against the Von Carstein alliances, subtle pressures applied to the independent lords whose support Zarek had secured, and one genuinely alarming incident in the fourth month when a group of High Court-aligned vampires arrived at the estate gates with documentation claiming emergency primacy authority under a subsection that Cassandra had not previously encountered. Zarek met them at the gates personally, which, given his reputation, was enough to make the situation extremely tense in a way that resolved quickly. He sent them back to the High Court with a 3-point legal counter-argument that Cassandra had drafted in 40 minutes upon hearing the news, and when he came back inside, he found her in the main archive with her jacket off and the ink still on her fingers, and he looked at her with an expression that was so openly and uncomplicatedly proud of her that she felt it like sunlight. Lucretius attempted one final escalation in the 6th month, filing a second anonymous complaint that this time alleged financial impropriety in Zarek's management of the estate, apparently hoping that a simultaneous financial audit would create enough pressure to force a political settlement. The attempt was extraordinary in its audacity and catastrophic in its execution because Cassandra had, in the process of her archival work, identified and documented a 30-year pattern of financial manipulation conducted by Lucretius himself against the estate's human employee compensation structures, and she had quietly included this documentation in the archive's supplementary files without drawing specific attention to it. When the financial auditors arrived, they found not evidence of Zarek's impropriety, but a comprehensive record of Lucretius's, which the alteration immediately accepted as additional evidence of the covenant of primacy's exploitative application. Lucretius was removed from his position as High Steward within the week, in a court proceeding that Cassandra attended in her capacity as the estate's chief archivist, and which was, she privately thought, among the most satisfying 2 hours of her professional life. The arbitration panel released its determination in the 9th month. The covenant of primacy was ruled to contain deliberate structural ambiguities that had been applied in a systematically harmful and legally inconsistent manner over 3 centuries. The panel stopped short of a full revocation, which had been the most optimistic possible outcome, but ordered a comprehensive mandatory revision process to remove the provisions that had enabled forced human wardship, with a revision committee whose compositions Zarek had significant influence over through his independent court alliances. It was not everything. It was not the clean, complete victory that the most optimistic version of the plan had targeted. But it was real, documented, legally binding change to a 300-year-old structure that had caused genuine harm, and it had been achieved through the collaboration of a vampire lord who had spent 40 years building the case, and a human archivist who had spent 6 months being dismissed by everyone who did not understand what she was actually doing. The night the determination was delivered, Zarek opened a bottle of wine that he said had been in the estate's cellar since 1891. He poured a glass for Cassandra, and held his own in a way that she had come to understand was the gesture rather than the consumption. Vampires did not drink wine in the same sense, but he held the glass because it was a shared ceremony, because the ritual of the thing mattered. "It is not complete," he said. "No," she agreed. "The revision process will take another year minimum, and the High Court will attempt to narrow the scope at every stage." "We will be watching every stage." "We will be watching every stage," she echoed, and the "we" settled between them like something that had always been true finding its proper home. He looked at her across the room. She had kicked off her shoes and tucked her feet under her in the reading chair, the good wine in her hand, her hair slightly undone from the day. Completely herself in a way that she had stopped being careful about, around him, sometime in the 5th month, when she had realized that he was not watching her to assess or manage her, but simply because she was someone he wanted to be looking at. "I have a question," he said. "Yes." The turning. "The arbitration is complete. The political conditions that Mira described are substantially changed." Cassandra set down her glass. She looked at him with the direct steadiness that was her nature. "Are you asking me the question, or are you working up to asking me the question?" The not-quite smile, which had become a real smile over 9 months, appeared. "I am asking you," he said, "whether you would like to have a conversation about it." "I would like to have the conversation," she said. "I have been thinking about it for approximately 6 months, which I assume you are aware of." "I was not certain you had decided." "I decided in the 6th month," she said. "I was waiting to see if it would be possible before I said it." She held his gaze with everything she had. "I want to stay. Not for 8 months or a year or a human lifetime. I want to stay the way you stay, permanently, and in this world, and in this work, and with you." She paused. "If that is also what you want." He crossed the room without speaking, and when he reached her, he took her face in his hands the same way she had taken his that first night in the park. And he said very quietly against her temple, "It is everything I want." The turning was not performed immediately. There was a process. There were legal notifications required under the new revised protocols that the revision committee had already begun implementing, and there was time, which neither of them was in a hurry to rush through, because the present was too good to skip. But the conversation had been had, and the future had a shape, and in the hidden chamber that both of them now shared openly. Because the room was no longer a secret. It had been formally registered as part of the estate archive in the arbitration settlement, which gave it a legal protection it had never held under concealment. They worked together in the evenings, with the particular quality of people who know they are exactly where they are supposed to be. The court had changed around them. Lucretius was gone. Mira had recalculated and adopted a careful neutrality that was at least functionally respectful. Aldrich Tessever had made an awkward but genuine attempt at civility after watching the arbitration outcome. Apparently I signed and saying that the politically shrewd position was to be on the side of the person who had dismantled a 300-year-old High Court provision with footnotes. The junior court members who had misfiled Cassandra's reference materials had been retasked to other departments and replaced with a human-vampire mixed archival team that Cassandra had designed, because part of the arbitration settlement included a provision for human professional representation in estate administrative structures, and she had moved immediately to implement it. The new Archivist team was introduced at a court meeting that Cassandra ran with the exact same measured calm that she had used to face down Lucretius on the night the chamber opened, and the court received it with varying degrees of grace. And Zarek watched from his seat at the head of the room, with the open, unperformed expression of a man who had found the thing he had been building toward for 40 years, and discovered that it was better than the plan. On a Wednesday evening in November, 6 months after the arbitration determination, with the legal notifications filed, and the revision committee in session, and the rain coming down against the windows of the estate in the particular heavy manner of late autumn, Cassandra Blackwell went into the hidden archive and did not come out the same. The process was not violent. This was something she had researched thoroughly, because she was who she was, and Zarek had answered every question she had with the patience and precision she had come to expect from him. There was pain, but the kind of pain that belongs to transformation, to the crossing of a threshold that has only one direction, and she crossed it with the same focused courage she had brought to every other threshold she had ever faced. She was with someone she trusted completely, in a room that had been built for her before she arrived. Under circumstances she had chosen with full information and full agency. When she opened her eyes, on the other side, the room looked different. Everything looked different. The textures and depths of the world rendered in a new register, sharper and stranger and more beautiful than she had previously had the equipment to perceive. And the first thing she saw, clearly and completely, was Zarek, his face. The amber of his eyes with the light behind them, that she now understood came from somewhere very old and very specific to what he was, and the expression he wore looking at her, which was the most unguarded and complete thing she had ever seen on a face. She sat up. She took stock. She said, with entirely characteristic calm, "The light in this room is extraordinary. I had no idea the ambient illumination was this complex." He laughed, not the controlled sound to use with the court, a real laugh from somewhere deep and genuine, and it filled the hidden archive with a warmth that the room had been waiting for, she thought, for a very long time. He reached for her hand, and she took it, and they were the same temperature now. She was learning that, feeling her own new cold and his familiar cold as the same thing, and she looked at the shelves of the archive around them, 300 years of careful documentation of harm and resistance, and the long, patient work of trying to change something that mattered, and she thought about locks and ciphers, and the specific intelligence required to understand that a door had been built for you, and the particular courage required to open it. She thought about her mother's letters in a box, and a choice made at 19 about whether to protect yourself from grief, or choose the fullness of what was present. She thought about 6 months of being dismissed by a court that had been taking its cue from the appearance of indifference, and the 3 days of work that had moved faster than anyone thought possible, and the first night she had kissed someone who was both the most dangerous and most genuinely honorable person she had ever known. She thought about all of it, and then she let it settle into the past where it belonged, and turned to look at Zarek, who was watching her with the amber eyes that had been the last human thing she had seen, and the first new thing. "The revision committee meets on Thursday," she said. "I know," he said. "I intend to attend. I have notes." "Of course you do." The warmth in his voice was everything. "I would expect nothing less." She stood, and he stood with her. And they were both exactly who they had always been. The archivist who never stopped working, and the vampire lord, who had built a room and waited for someone intelligent enough to open it. And everything between them had the quality of something that had been given the full length of time it needed to become what it was, and had arrived there complete. The hidden archive held 3 centuries of documentation. It would hold many more, and every record, every page, every careful notation in the margins of the long and complicated story of what the world was and what it could become, was kept now by 2 people who had built something together in the dark and chosen to carry it forward into whatever was coming. The lock had not moved in 300 years. Now it would never need to close again.